Starting a garden from scratch can feel really overwhelming, and many people get stuck at what soil to use, when to fertilize, whether or not they should plant in raised beds and containers or directly in the ground. And the truth is, you just need to take action and get started. Hey there, I'm Audrey Crawford, and I am a California gardener in Zone 9. I teach you the tried and true methods of gardening in our climate and break down complicated gardening advice into simple and actionable steps so that you can grow your best garden yet. This is the Audrey's Little Farm Show. So in today's show, we're going to cover 3 of my best tips for starting your garden from scratch. This is often the most overwhelming step for gardeners because they just don't know where to begin. And once you get started, gardening gets so much more simple because you have started and you can just tweak and amend things and add more to your list, but getting started can be tough. So tip number 1 is to evaluate your space. Do you have an open dirt plot where you want to plant directly in the ground? Do you want to grow in raised beds, or do you only have the space for containers? The next thing is to think about and figure out which area gets the most sunlight. The majority of vegetables need 6 to 8 hours of sunlight per day to thrive. And so when you're evaluating your space, keep in mind that the sun changes throughout the year. So if you're looking at this in wintertime, know that in spring and summer, the sun is going to be in a different location. So make sure you're placing your garden in an area that will get 6 to 8 hours of sunlight per day. And this doesn't have to be continuous in one straight shot. It can be broken up throughout the day. Just by the end of the day, plants need at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. And since we're in zone 9 where summers get hot, if you can put your plants in an area that gets afternoon shade, that's always ideal because the afternoon sun is the most harsh. And so if we can shade our plants from that, that's ideal. But of course, the most important thing is that they get plenty of sunlight. And so once you figure out the best place for your garden that receives enough sunlight, you need to figure out if you're going to plant in containers, raised beds, or directly in the ground, or a combination of all 3. For myself, I have raised beds, long rows with crops planted directly in the ground, and I have a few large containers, and there are benefits to each. So the raised bed benefits are that you start with a good quality mixture of soil, which we'll get into a little bit later on, and you don't have to worry about amending your in-ground soil. Sometimes it's just the easiest thing to just start off with that good quality mixture of soil, get your raised bed set up. They're off the ground, which makes harvesting and planting easier. There's so many nice benefits to raised bed gardening. But the downsides are that you have to build or buy the raised beds. You have to fill them with the soil, and it's just a bit more to add onto your plate. But if you want to grow in raised beds, one of my favorite options is the Ollie Gardens raised bed. I've personally grown in them over this past summer, and they did great. They're really easy to put together. And the nice part is you don't have to worry about going out and buying all of the materials and making sure you have the right tools. You just order your raised beds. They'll get delivered right to your doorstep. You'll have them put together in an afternoon, and then you'll be able to plant your garden. So if you're not sure which type of raised beds to get, I would definitely check out Ollie Gardens. I will link to them in the description, and you can use the code Audrey10 for 10% off. So the next way to plant is directly in the ground. And this is really my favorite option because you don't have to buy soil. You don't have to build anything. You just plant your garden directly in the soil. But I know you're probably thinking, what if your soil isn't good? And that's a problem for a lot of gardeners. You might have poor quality soil that isn't ideal for planting, and so it may not be a great option. But if you have good soil, I would definitely recommend planting directly in the ground. And remember that over time, you will amend your soil, and you can even do things right from the start to amend your soil. They make products that help break up heavy clay soil, help amend sandy soil. And so there are things you can just add to your in-ground soil that will help the quality and help your plants to grow to the best that they can. And then you will continue to add compost and other organic matter to that soil season after season. And so within a few years, you're going to have a really good quality mixture of in-ground soil. So consider just planting in the ground and continuing to amend. And remember that gardening is a long game, not a short-term game. And so, if you can just amend your existing soil, that's just a really easy, great option. And then the next thing is container gardening. And container gardening is great because it's pretty much accessible to everyone. No matter how much space you have, you can grow in containers. You can place them just on your back patio. You can place them on a balcony. You can even do a few things indoors in containers, like some kitchen herbs. So container gardening is just accessible to everyone. And so no matter what scale of gardening you want to get started with, there is something for you. You can plant in the ground, in raised beds, or in containers. And you can combine all three, and you can even test out what you like best. And now tip number 2 is to start with good soil right from the start. So this can be a little bit difficult because there are so many varying opinions. If you search what kind of soil to use on the internet, you're going to come across about 10,000 different opinions. But a lot of people just go the simple route and they go down to their garden center and they buy bags and bags and bags of potting soil. And this can get really expensive really fast. And it's also not the best option for raised beds. Container gardening is different, but for raised beds, we have a lot of space to fill. And the nice part about filling all that space is that if we fill it with a good quality mixture of soil, our plants will grow healthier and we'll have the opportunity of watering less. So we'll get to save water and have healthier plants. And so the best option for filling your raised beds is about 70 to 80% topsoil and 20 to 30% compost. The compost is what's going to give some texture to your soil and make it a little bit more fluffy, and it's going to add nutrients for root growth, and it's going to add the nutrients to your soil. But the clay that is in your topsoil is what's going to hold on to moisture. If you only use bagged potting soils or bagged mixtures with all organic materials, they drain really well, which is good for a lot of potted plants. But in our raised beds, we don't want them to drain that fast because that means the roots are going to dry out faster and we're going to just have to water more often. Think of your raised beds as an extension of your in-ground garden. So even if you don't have the most ideal in-ground soil, just think of nature. Everything is planted or everything is growing just directly in the ground. And so we want to replicate that for our raised beds. And so filling up your raised beds with a majority of topsoil, of course you want to order a good quality mixture of topsoil. And so if you have good quality good quality ground soil, you can just scoop that up and put that in your raised beds. If you don't, you can order topsoil. And the really nice thing is that if you have a lot of raised beds to fill, you can often order topsoil in bulk and have it delivered. And that is such a more cost-effective solution. And another thing that you will see common on the internet is to fill the bottoms of the raised beds with different kinds of materials like logs and twigs and leaves and all sorts of other materials to fill up some of that space before you add the soil. And the problem with that is that over time, those materials break down. So you're going to have to add back soil at some point in time anyways. So I really recommend just starting off with your mixture of compost and topsoil, and then you don't have to add more in the future. Of course, after each season, it's always a good idea to add compost to the top layer of your soil to add nutrients back into your soil. But if you fill up your beds with things that decompose over time, those soil levels are just going to constantly drop, and you're always going to have to add more to your raised beds. And now, tip number 3 is to direct sow seeds. In many climates, gardeners need a head start on their growing season, and so planting transplants is a way that they get ahead of the game and they can take advantage of growing for a longer period of time. But here in Zone 9, we have such a long growing season that direct sowing seeds is often our best option. And I know that planting by seed may seem like more of an advanced gardening strategy, but it's really the opposite. When you start your seeds indoors or in a greenhouse versus just planting directly by seed, it requires so much more planning and work because you have to take care of those seedlings. You have to make sure they receive enough light and heat. Then you have to harden off the seedlings. There's just a lot of steps that go into it. But when you plant directly in the ground, once the weather allows, you just plant the seed, water, and watch the plant grow. It's really that simple. But the important thing to note is that not all vegetables should be planted directly by seed. Tomatoes and peppers are 2 common summer vegetables that should always be transplanted. So you should either buy them as transplants or start them yourself. But when it comes to many of your other summer crops, like your squashes, pumpkins, cucumbers, okra, eggplant, all of those things can just be planted directly by seed out in the garden once the weather allows. And then, of course, all of your root crops like carrots, beets, radishes, and turnips should always be directly sown by seed as well. And one of the things that you may have experienced in the past, or if this is going to be your first time gardening, you may not have experienced it yet. So this would be a really good tip, is that some of these vegetables that you can buy as transplants, like your squashes and cucumbers, even though they can be transplanted, they don't like their roots disturbed. So if you transplant them, you're just setting that plant up for failure. Of course, it can still grow and produce well, but if you plant it directly by seed, you don't deal with disturbing the roots of the plant, and it's going to grow and produce so much more healthy than if you were to transplant it. And it can be a little bit confusing because when you go to the garden center and you see all these transplants, it might just seem easier to buy them as transplants, but really planting so many crops by seed is going to give you healthier plants, and it is so much cheaper. Buying a packet of seeds versus a already started transplant is no comparison. So, for example, you can spend a couple dollars on a packet of seeds or $3 to $6 on just one plant. And the last thing about direct sowing seeds is that you really just need to watch your weather. Make sure you're planting after all danger of frost has passed, depending on the crops you're growing. Of course, if you're growing cool season crops like carrots and lettuce, then you can plant when the weather is still cool. But if you're planting your spring garden with all your warm weather summer vegetables, then you need to make sure all danger of frost has passed and that you direct sow your seeds when the soil is warm enough for those seeds to germinate. That's really the only step. And then just make sure you keep that soil well watered and moist until you see germination, because that top layer of soil is always what dries out the fastest. And so you want to make sure those seeds are staying moist to support germination. And those are our 3 best tips for starting your first garden. Just considering where you want to plant and the method for planting, filling your raised beds with a good quality mixture of soil right from the start, and then taking the leap at direct sowing your seeds. It's really such a simple process, and I really think you're going to have such better success by direct sowing your seeds versus planting all transplants. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Audrey's Little Farm Show. I would be so appreciative if you would rate and subscribe to the podcast so that other gardeners can learn about our show as well. And for more information and to get a free planting schedule that I created for you, just head to the link in the description, and I will see you in the next episode.